My name is Ezekiel Nash, Water Systems Engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. 48 hours ago, I watched nuclear missiles arc across the sky as alien ships descended upon our reservoirs. They came for our water. I've barricaded myself in an underground facility with 3 other survivors. Everything I know about water systems might be humanity's last defense against this nuclear alien apocalypse. This is how I survived the first 2 days of hell on Earth. Before we start the video, let us know what country you're tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I suppose I should start from the beginning. 48 hours. That's how long it's been since the world as we knew it ended. My name is Ezekiel Nash, but everyone calls me Zeke. I'm a water systems engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in municipal water infrastructure and emergency water management. That title used to sound boring at parties. Now, it might be the reason I'm still alive. I'm recording this from an underground municipal water facility about 15 miles outside Flagstaff, Arizona. The power is running on backup generators, and I don't know how long they'll last. I need to document what happened while my memory is still fresh. If anyone finds this recording, maybe it will help you survive what's coming. Tuesday, July 14th, 2026. That was the last normal day. I remember it started like any other. I woke up at 5:30, made coffee in my apartment, and headed to our regional office for the morning briefing. The Southwest had been dealing with extreme drought conditions for years, and my team was responsible for maintaining water security across northern Arizona. That morning's briefing focused on structural integrity concerns at Lake Mary, the reservoir that supplies most of Flagstaff's water. Recent seismic activity had raised some red flags in our monitoring systems, and I was assigned to perform an on-site inspection. Nothing urgent, just routine maintenance checks. On my drive out to the reservoir, I noticed more military convoys than usual on the highway. In retrospect, that should have been my first warning sign. There had been growing tensions between major powers for months. Territorial disputes in the Arctic, naval standoffs in the South China Sea, the usual geopolitical chess game. But like most people, I tuned it out. International politics was just background noise in my daily life. I was more concerned with pH levels and structural integrity reports. Water has always been my obsession, especially since what happened in Flint, Michigan years ago. That crisis changed the trajectory of my career. It showed me how fragile our infrastructure really is, how quickly things can go from normal to catastrophic when water systems fail. I dedicated my life to preventing another Flint. Now I'm witnessing something far worse. I should mention that last week my friend Dr. Eliza Montgomery from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration had sent me some unusual satellite data. She detected strange atmospheric anomalies over major bodies of water across North America. Unexplained temperature fluctuations, odd vapor patterns. We both assumed it was related to climate change or equipment malfunction. We were wrong. So wrong. I arrived at Lake Mary around 1:30 in the afternoon. The reservoir looked normal at first glance, water levels lower than historical averages, but that was expected given the drought. I parked my government-issued truck near the monitoring station and got to work, setting up my portable analysis kit to take water samples. The first reading came back with anomalies. The mineral composition was off, elevated levels of metallic compounds that shouldn't have been there. I ran the test again, thinking my equipment might be malfunctioning. Same result. I called Eliza, hoping she might have some insight. Eliza, I'm getting strange readings from Lake Mary. The water composition shows unusual concentrations of rare earth metals and something I can't identify. She sounded concerned. That matches what we're seeing in satellite data. We've detected similar anomalies in the Great Lakes, the Mississippi, and major reservoirs across the country. I was about to call you, actually. Something's happening on a national scale, Zeke. We just don't know what. That's when all our phones started blaring. Emergency alerts. Nuclear launch detected. Multiple detonations confirmed. Seek immediate shelter. The call dropped. The power at the monitoring station flickered and died. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at my phone as more alerts came through. Then the cellular network collapsed too. I ran outside, scanning the horizon. Far to the south, in the direction of Phoenix, I saw it. A mushroom cloud rising like a terrible monument to human failure. 140 miles away, yet clearly visible. The shockwave wouldn't reach this far, but the fallout eventually would. In that moment, while I was still processing what I was seeing, something else caught my eye. Lights in the sky. Not aircraft, not like anything I'd ever seen before. They moved with impossible speed and precision, descending toward the reservoir. 3 disc-shaped craft, each about the size of a commercial airliner, metallic and smooth. My first instinct was to run to my truck, but some deeper survival instinct told me to hide instead. I ducked behind the concrete pump house, watching as these objects positioned themselves over the water. They hovered silently, maybe 50 feet above the surface. Then something extended from their undersides, long, articulated appendages that plunged into the reservoir. They were extracting something from the water. Not just collecting it, they seemed to be selectively pulling specific elements or compounds. The water around these appendages churned and changed color, becoming cloudy and then clear again, but different somehow. Even from a distance, I could tell the composition was being altered. In the far distance, I could see more nuclear detonations, bright flashes on the horizon followed by rising mushroom clouds. But the aliens, because what else could they be, seemed unconcerned by the nuclear exchange. If anything, they appeared to be intensifying their activity with each new detonation. A military helicopter appeared, approaching from the direction of the Flagstaff Army National Guard base. It opened fire on one of the craft, but the bullets or missiles seemed to do nothing. Without any visible counterattack, the helicopter suddenly lost power and spiraled down, crashing into the forest about a mile away. I needed to move. The radiation from the nuclear exchange would eventually reach this area, and whatever these beings were doing to our water supply couldn't be good. My satellite phone was still working. The military-grade communications network was more resilient than commercial ones. I sent a quick message to my supervisor. Unknown craft at Lake Mary. Extracting something from water. Heading to Flagstaff Underground Municipal Facility. I knew I needed to get to safety, and I knew exactly where to go. The municipal water treatment facility had an underground section designed to withstand natural disasters. It was built during the Cold War, part of our critical infrastructure protection program. If anywhere would be safe from both nuclear fallout and whatever these things were, it would be there. The drive back toward Flagstaff was chaos. People had heard the alerts or seen the mushroom clouds. Everyone was trying to flee or find shelter. Traffic was gridlocked on the main roads, so I took service roads and fire lanes, using my government vehicle clearance and my knowledge of the back routes. Along the way, I saw more of those craft in the distance, always positioned over water sources, lakes, rivers, even water treatment plants. They weren't attacking people directly. They were focused entirely on the water. I reached the facility by skirting the eastern edge of the city, avoiding the worst of the panic. The security gate was abandoned. I used my access card and emergency codes to enter, then sealed the heavy blast doors behind me. The backup generators kicked in automatically when the main power failed, illuminating the underground complex with emergency lighting. I was alone, at least at first. The facility was designed to be largely automated, with minimal staff during normal operations. I secured the entrances, took stock of supplies, and tried to make contact with other government agencies. Most channels were down, but the emergency satellite network was still functioning intermittently. That first night, I sat alone in the control room, watching as the world collapsed. Through the facility's monitoring systems, I could see radiation levels rising outside. The water quality sensors in the main reservoir showed rapidly changing composition. Something was happening to our water, something unprecedented. I didn't sleep. How could I? I kept thinking about what I'd seen at the reservoir, trying to make sense of it. These weren't just random attacks. The craft were methodical, precise. They came directly to our water sources as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. What I saw at Lake Mary still haunts me. I remember parking near the monitoring station, grabbing my testing equipment, and heading toward the water's edge. Everything seemed normal, just another day on the job. The lake surface was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky. Birds were flying overhead, nature carrying on, oblivious to what was coming. When I dipped the first testing probes into the water, I expected routine results. But the handheld analyzer started giving readings that made no sense. The mineral composition was significantly altered from our baseline measurements taken just a week earlier. Elevated levels of rare earth metals, unusual isotope concentrations, and something else. A compound I couldn't identify with my field equipment. I ran the test 3 more times, thinking there must be an equipment malfunction. Each time, the same anomalous readings appeared. That's when I called Eliza at NOAA. She had become a close colleague after we worked together on water security projects following the megadrought of 2024. "These readings don't make sense," I told her, sending the data to her tablet. "The water chemistry has changed dramatically in just 7 days. Her voice grew concerned as she analyzed the results. "Zeke, we've been seeing similar anomalies across multiple major water sources nationwide. The satellite imaging shows strange thermal patterns and unexplained chemical shifts. Something is systematically altering our water supply, but we don't know what's causing it." I remember feeling a chill despite the warm July afternoon. Could it be industrial contamination? Maybe unreported dumping? "No, that's what's so bizarre," she replied. "The changes are too uniform, too precise. This isn't random pollution, it's almost like—" That's when the emergency alerts cut her off. Every phone in the country blaring the same warning. Nuclear launch detected. Multiple detonations confirmed. Seek immediate shelter. The call dropped instantly. I stood there frozen, staring at my phone as more alerts flooded in. The power at the monitoring station flickered and died. Cell service followed moments later. Just like that, we were thrown back to the Stone Age. I ran outside, scanning the horizon, and that's when I saw it. To the south, over Phoenix, a mushroom cloud was rising, 140 miles away, yet clearly visible against the blue sky. I felt my legs go weak. This wasn't a drill or a mistake. This was really happening. But what happened next is why I'm recording this message, because while I was staring at that distant nuclear explosion, something else entered our atmosphere, something that makes nuclear war seem like a minor problem. The lights appeared high in the sky first, bright points moving with impossible speed and precision. Not aircraft, not missiles. They moved like nothing manufactured on Earth. 3 disc-shaped objects descended rapidly toward Lake Mary, positioning themselves in a triangular formation above the water's surface. I ducked behind the concrete pump house, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The crafts hovered silently about 50 feet above the reservoir. They were metallic, smooth, with no visible seams or propulsion systems, each roughly the size of a commercial airliner. Then something extended from their undersides, long, articulated appendages that reminded me of surgical instruments. These probes plunged into the water, and the area around them began to change. The water churned and shifted color, becoming cloudy and then clear again, but different somehow. They were extracting or altering something in the water. What struck me most was their complete disregard for the nuclear detonations happening across the horizon. More mushroom clouds were now visible in the distance, bright flashes followed by those terrible rising columns. But the craft continued their work, methodical and precise. If anything, they seemed to intensify their activity with each new explosion. A military helicopter appeared from the direction of Flagstaff, likely scrambled from the National Guard base. It opened fire on one of the craft. I could see tracer rounds and what looked like missiles striking the metallic surface, but they had no effect whatsoever. There was no visible counterattack. The helicopter simply lost power mid-flight, its rotors stopping completely before it spiraled down into the forest about a mile away. I realized then that the nuclear war and the arrival of these craft couldn't be coincidental. Were they taking advantage of our self-destruction? Had they somehow triggered it? I didn't have answers, only the certainty that I needed to get somewhere safe. As I watched, the water in Lake Mary began to take on a strange, almost luminescent quality where the probes had been working. The craft continued their extraction for several more minutes before retracting their appendages and rising rapidly into the sky, moving toward other water sources in the region. I made a split-second decision. I had to get to the underground municipal water facility. It was designed to withstand disasters, had independent power, air filtration, and most importantly, access to the regional water system. If these things were after our water, I needed to be where I could monitor and potentially control access to it. The roads back toward Flagstaff were already crowded with panicked people trying to flee. Military vehicles were heading in the opposite direction, toward the border. I took back roads and service access routes that few people knew about, advantages of working for the Army Corps of Engineers. As I drove, I kept seeing more of those craft in the distance, always positioned over water sources, lakes, rivers, even smaller treatment plants. They weren't attacking people or infrastructure directly. They were focused entirely on the water. What terrified me most was their efficiency. They knew exactly where to go, exactly what to target. This wasn't a random attack or exploration. They had a plan, and somehow it involved our most precious resource. When I finally reached the outskirts of Flagstaff, the situation had deteriorated quickly. Power was out across most of the city. People were abandoning their vehicles on blocked highways. I could see National Guard troops trying to maintain order at major intersections, but they were overwhelmed. I needed to reach that underground facility before fallout from the nuclear detonations arrived, before the full effects of whatever the aliens were doing to our water became apparent. I had to use my knowledge to do something, anything, to help humanity survive what was clearly just the beginning of something terrible. What I didn't realize then was how crucial those water samples I'd taken would become. The readings that made no sense were actually the first warning signs of a calculated, methodical invasion that had been quietly preparing for months, right under our noses. The atmospheric anomalies Eliza had detected weren't random events. They were reconnaissance. What I witnessed at Lake Mary was just the first visible phase of a plan that had been set in motion long before the first nuclear missile was launched. I made it to my truck just as another bright flash lit up the western sky. Another detonation. I couldn't tell where exactly. Somewhere in Nevada or California, maybe. It didn't matter. What mattered was getting to safety. The drive back toward Flagstaff was pure chaos. People had either seen the mushroom clouds or received emergency alerts. Everyone was trying to flee at once, with no idea where to go. Main roads were completely gridlocked, cars abandoned on shoulders, families walking with whatever they could carry. The panic was palpable. I took service roads and maintenance access routes that the public didn't know about. One advantage of working for the Army Corps of Engineers is knowing all the back ways into critical infrastructure. Even these routes were getting crowded as people desperately searched for any path out of the city. At one intersection, I nearly collided with a military convoy heading in the opposite direction. National Guard vehicles moving south toward Phoenix. I tried flagging them down to tell them what I'd seen at the reservoir, but they blew past at high speed. They had their orders, and civilian reports of flying saucers clearly weren't a priority with nuclear weapons in play. My satellite phone buzzed. It was a colleague from the Denver office, her voice breaking up through static. "Zeke, are you seeing this? They're at every major reservoir in Colorado. These things, they're extracting something from the water. Tests show complete molecular restructuring of the water after they've processed it. It's not safe to drink anymore." "I saw them at Lake Mary," I told her. "What are they? Have you heard anything official?" "Nothing. Military channels are focused on the nuclear exchange. Nobody's talking about these things. But Zeke, they're systematically targeting our water supply. All of it. This is coordinated." The call cut out before I could respond. I tried calling back, but couldn't connect. The satellite network was getting overloaded. As I approached the eastern edge of Flagstaff, I saw another alien craft hovering over the city's main water treatment plant. This one was different, smaller, more agile. It was inserting something into the facility rather than extracting water. Some kind of device or probe. My stomach turned at the thought of what might happen to people who drank that water. I skirted around the north side of the city, avoiding population centers. The municipal water facility I was heading for was isolated, built into the side of a small mountain about 15 miles outside town. It was one of those Cold War legacies, designed to maintain water supply even after a nuclear attack. When I reached the access road, I found the security gate abandoned. The guard booth was empty, the barrier arm still down. I used my clearance card and emergency access codes to open the gate, then drove through and closed it behind me. Better to limit access as much as possible. The facility itself was partially underground, with only a concrete entryway and ventilation systems visible from the surface. I parked near the entrance and gathered my equipment: testing kit, satellite phone, emergency pack I kept in the truck. As I approached the heavy steel door, I heard the distinctive sound of jet engines overhead. Military aircraft, flying low and fast. I looked up just in time to see them engage with something in the distance. Bright flashes, trails of smoke from missiles. Then one of the jets simply dropped from the sky as if its power had been cut instantly. I punched in my access code, and the massive door unlocked with a heavy clunk. Inside was a small antechamber with another security door. I repeated the process, then sealed both doors behind me. The facility's emergency lighting was on, powered by backup generators that kicked in when the main power failed. The underground complex was eerily quiet. It was designed to be largely automated, with minimal staff during normal operations. Given the situation, I expected to find at least some personnel who had taken shelter here, but the place seemed deserted. I made my way to the control center, a room filled with monitoring equipment, communication systems, and access to the entire regional water network. From here, I could monitor water quality, control flow between different reservoirs and treatment facilities, and potentially isolate sections of the system. The first thing I did was check the status of the water supply. The monitors showed increasingly alarming data. Lake Mary's chemical composition was changing rapidly. The water was being fundamentally altered at a molecular level. Whatever those craft were doing, they were transforming our water into something else. I tried establishing contact with other facilities and emergency services. Most channels were down. The few that responded described similar situations: unknown craft appearing over water sources, alterations to water composition, breakdown of civil order as panic spread. Then something caught my eye on one of the exterior security cameras. Movement outside the main entrance. I zoomed in and felt a surge of relief. People, human survivors seeking shelter. I counted 4 of them looking desperate and frightened. I had a decision to make. Opening the doors meant compromising the facility's security, but turning away survivors went against everything I believed in. I used the intercom to communicate with them. "Identify yourselves," I said. A woman stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Lucy Chen, chemical engineer from Northern Arizona University. We need shelter. Please." I asked a question only someone with relevant knowledge would know to verify she was who she claimed. "What's the molecular formula for dichloramine?" "NHCl2, she answered without hesitation. I let them in, sealing the doors quickly behind them. Besides Dr. Chen, there was a National Guard medic named Marcus Okafor, an elderly man who introduced himself as a retired geologist, and a teenage boy who was too shocked to speak. As I showed them to the facility's break room where they could rest, Marcus pulled me aside. "You need to see this," he said, showing me his medical tablet. "These are samples from patients at the hospital before I left. People who drank water after those things appeared. The images showed cellular deterioration unlike anything I'd seen before. Blood samples with strange crystalline structures forming. Tissue samples showing systematic breakdown at a cellular level." "How long after exposure?" I asked. "Hours," he replied grimly. "Just hours." That's when the implications hit me fully. Those craft weren't just sampling our water, they were changing it, making it toxic to human life. And they were doing it to every major water source they could find. We gathered in the control center to share information. Dr. Chen had been at the university when the first alerts came through. She'd seen the craft from her laboratory window as they positioned themselves over campus water towers. "They're not just altering the water," she explained. "They're preparing it for something. The chemical changes follow a pattern consistent with terraforming, making our environment suitable for a different form of life." The retired geologist Dr. Harrison had been studying unusual seismic patterns around major aquifers for months. "There were signs," he said quietly. "Vibrations at specific frequencies near water sources. We thought it was related to drought-induced ground shifts. But they were scanning, mapping our water resources from below." Young Darius, the teenager, finally spoke up. He'd been fishing at Lake Mary when the craft appeared. "They put something in the water," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before they started taking stuff out, they dropped these little metal things that dissolved. That was 2 weeks ago. I told the park ranger, but he thought I was making it up. 2 weeks ago. They had been preparing the water before they arrived in force, before the nuclear weapons flew. How long had they been planning this? As I approached the heavy steel door, I heard the distinctive sound of jet engines overhead. Military aircraft, flying low and fast. I looked up just in time to see them engage with something in the distance. Bright flashes, trails of smoke from missiles. Then one of the jets simply dropped from the sky as if its power had been cut instantly. I punched in my access code and the massive door unlocked with a heavy clunk. Inside was a small antechamber with another security door. I repeated the process, then sealed both doors behind me. The facility's emergency lighting was on, powered by backup generators that kicked in when the main power failed. The underground complex was eerily quiet. It was designed to be largely automated, with minimal staff during normal operations. Given the situation, I expected to find at least some personnel who had taken shelter here, but the place seemed deserted. I made my way to the control center. a room filled with monitoring equipment, communication systems, and access to the entire regional water network. From here, I could monitor water quality, control flow between different reservoirs and treatment facilities, and potentially isolate sections of the system. The first thing I did was check the status of the water supply. The monitors showed increasingly alarming data. Lake Mary's chemical composition was changing rapidly. The water was being fundamentally altered at a molecular level. Whatever those craft were doing, they were transforming our water into something else. I tried establishing contact with other facilities and emergency services. Most channels were down. The few that responded described similar situations: unknown craft appearing over water sources, alterations to water composition, breakdown of civil order as panic spread. Then something caught my eye on one of the exterior security cameras. Movement outside the main entrance. I zoomed in and felt a surge of relief. People, human survivors seeking shelter. I counted 4 of them looking desperate and frightened. I had a decision to make. Opening the doors meant compromising the facility's security, but turning away survivors went against everything I believed in. I used the intercom to communicate with them. "Identify yourselves," I said. A woman stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Lucy Chen, chemical engineer from Northern Arizona University. We need shelter. Please." I asked a question only someone with relevant knowledge would know to verify she was who she claimed. "What's the molecular formula for dichloramine?" "NHCl2, she answered without hesitation. I let them in, sealing the doors quickly behind them. Besides Dr. Chen, there was a National Guard medic named Marcus Okafor, an elderly man who introduced himself as a retired geologist, and a teenage boy who was too shocked to speak. As I showed them to the facility's break room where they could rest, Marcus pulled me aside. "You need to see this," he said, showing me his medical tablet. "These are samples from patients at the hospital before I left. People who drank water after those things appeared. The images showed cellular deterioration unlike anything I'd seen before. Blood samples with strange crystalline structures forming. Tissue samples showing systematic breakdown at a cellular level." "How long after exposure?" I asked. "Hours," he replied grimly. "Just hours." That's when the implications hit me fully. Those craft weren't just sampling our water, they were changing it, making it toxic to human life. And they were doing it to every major water source they could find. We gathered in the control center to share information. Dr. Chen had been at the university when the first alerts came through. She'd seen the craft from her laboratory window as they positioned themselves over campus water towers. "They're not just altering the water," she explained. "They're preparing it for something. The chemical changes follow a pattern consistent with terraforming, making our environment suitable for a different form of life." The retired geologist Dr. Harrison had been studying unusual seismic patterns around major aquifers for months. "There were signs," he said quietly. "Vibrations at specific frequencies near water sources. We thought it was related to drought-induced ground shifts. But they were scanning, mapping our water resources from below." Young Darius, the teenager, finally spoke up. He'd been fishing at Lake Mary when the craft appeared. "They put something in the water," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before they started taking stuff out, they dropped these little metal things that dissolved. That was 2 weeks ago. I told the park ranger, but he thought I was making it up. 2 weeks ago. They had been preparing the water before they arrived in force, before the nuclear weapons flew. How long had they been planning this?" Marcus provided medical data showing how the altered water affected human physiology. Dr. Harrison contributed his knowledge of regional geology and groundwater systems. Even young Darius helped, marking on maps where he'd seen the strange devices being dropped into water sources before the main invasion. "They're following the water," I explained, pointing to the pattern on our maps. Surface water first, then working their way down to connected groundwater systems. But they're missing these isolated aquifers, either because they don't know about them or can't access them easily. "So what do we do?" asked Marcus. "We can't just hide down here forever." "We need to secure access to untainted water," I said, "and we need to understand exactly what they're doing to it. If we know their process, maybe we can disrupt it." Dr. Chen looked up from her microscope. "I've been analyzing the water samples. The molecular changes are precise and systematic. They're enriching certain elements while eliminating others. Specifically, they're increasing concentrations of elements that are rare on Earth but might be common in other planetary systems. They're making our water like their water," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "Exactly," Chen nodded. "It's terraforming, but focused on water composition rather than atmosphere. Change the water, and you change everything that depends on it, which, on Earth, is essentially all life." A terrible thought occurred to me. The radiation. What if it's not just accelerating the process? What if it's part of the process? What if their biological systems actually require radioactive elements that are rare on Earth in normal conditions? Chen's eyes widened. That would explain the targeting of the nuclear weapons. They needed to irradiate large water sources quickly to make the environment more hospitable for themselves, while making it lethal for us, Marcus added grimly. I turned to the monitoring systems, checking radiation levels outside. They were elevated, but not immediately lethal, except near water sources that had been processed by the alien craft. Those showed radiation signatures unlike anything in our database. Not just standard nuclear fallout, but something altered, enhanced. "We need to warn people," I said. "Anyone still out there needs to know not to use surface water, not even for washing. And we need to identify all isolated aquifers that might still be safe." "How do we do that with communications down?" asked Harrison. I thought about it. The water distribution system itself. We can use pressure changes in the pipes as a form of Morse code to communicate with other treatment facilities that might still be operational. Old-school hydraulic telegraph. It's slow, but it might work. I began reconfiguring the control systems to send pressure pulses through the municipal water lines. Simple coded messages warning about the water contamination and identifying potential safe sources. While I worked, Marcus shared more disturbing news from his medical observations. The water isn't just toxic, it's transformative. Patients who consumed it showed systematic cellular changes before death. Their tissue was being restructured at a molecular level. "Restructured how?" Chen asked. Marcus showed us microscope images from his medical tablet. Their cells began incorporating the new elements from the water, replacing normal biological compounds with these alien ones. It's like their bodies were being forcibly adapted to a different biochemistry. "They're not just changing the water," Harrison whispered. "They're changing us. Or trying to." "But it's killing people instead," I said. "Because we're not compatible with their biochemistry," Chen explained. "We evolved based on Earth's natural water composition. These changes are too radical, too fast for our biology to adapt." As night fell on that second day, we received a faint response to our hydraulic telegraph. Pressure pulses from another facility about 30 miles west. Survivors there confirmed similar observations and shared data about water sources in their region that remained untainted. I plotted these on our map, creating a network of potential safe water sources. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way to begin organizing resistance around the one resource we all needed to survive. What we didn't realize then was that our communications weren't as secure as we thought. The pressure changes in the water system had attracted attention, not just from other survivors, but from the invaders themselves. They were more attuned to water dynamics than we had imagined, and they were about to respond. On the morning of day 2, I realized we were running low on several critical supplies. The facility was well stocked with water treatment chemicals and emergency rations, but we lacked certain medical supplies and tools we would need to implement some of the plans we were developing. I made the difficult decision to venture outside to a nearby supply warehouse used by the water department. The facility had a security monitoring system that showed exterior conditions. Radiation levels were elevated but not immediately lethal for brief exposure. There was no sign of the alien craft in our immediate vicinity. If I was going to go, this was the time. I prepared carefully, gathering a radiation detector, my water testing kit, and a basic protection suit from the facility's emergency equipment. It wasn't a full hazmat suit, but it would provide some protection against fallout. Marcus gave me a list of medical supplies to look for, and Chen asked me to collect any chemical testing equipment I could find. "Be careful," Chen said as I prepared to leave through the facility's airlock system. "We'll monitor you from here. Any sign of those craft, you get back immediately." I nodded, sealing my protective gear and checking the oxygen supply. It wasn't designed for long-term use, just enough to get me to the warehouse and back without breathing contaminated air. Outside, the world had transformed. The sky had a strange, muted quality, dust and particulates from the nuclear detonations creating a hazy filter over the sun. The surrounding forest was eerily quiet. No bird calls or animal sounds, just the whisper of wind through the trees. I moved quickly, following a maintenance path that led to the warehouse about half a mile away. Every few minutes, I checked my radiation detector. The levels fluctuated, higher in some areas than others, but remained within the range my protection suit could handle. When I reached the warehouse, I found the security door ajar. Someone had already been there. I entered cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the dim interior. The place had been partially looted, but many supplies remained, particularly the more specialized equipment that civilian looters would have little use for. I was gathering chemical testing kits when I heard it, a faint mechanical hum that didn't belong to any of the building's systems. I froze, switching off my flashlight and listening. The sound moved, circling the warehouse exterior. Then it stopped, directly above the roof. Through a high window, I caught a glimpse of it, not one of the large craft I'd seen at the reservoir, but a smaller device, roughly spherical and about the size of a beach ball. A scout drone of some kind. It hovered outside, scanning the building with some form of energy beam that penetrated the walls. I ducked behind a large water purification unit, making myself as small as possible. The drone's scan swept through the warehouse, passing over my position. For a moment, I thought it had missed me. Then it paused, reversed, and focused directly on my hiding spot. It knew I was there. Somehow, it had detected me despite the concrete and metal between us. I had seconds to make a decision. Running would only confirm my presence. Fighting was pointless without weapons effective against their technology. That left only one option: the water. Next to me was a large testing tank used for calibrating water quality instruments. It was filled with purified water that hadn't been exposed to the outside environment since before the invasion. Without hesitation, I climbed into the tank, fully submerging myself, my protective suit providing enough buoyancy to keep me from sinking completely. Through the water and the transparent side of the tank, I watched as the drone entered the warehouse through a loading bay door. It moved methodically, scanning each section of the building. When it reached my position, it paused again, hovering directly in front of the water tank. Its scanning beam passed over the tank repeatedly, but it didn't detect me. Just as the craft at the reservoir seemed focused on the water rather than the humans nearby, this drone couldn't perceive me through the purified water. After what felt like an eternity, the drone moved on, completing its sweep of the warehouse before exiting through the same door it had entered. I waited another 5 minutes before cautiously emerging from the tank, water streaming from my protective suit. The suit had protected me from direct contact with the water, but I'd made a crucial discovery. They couldn't detect humans through water, at least not purified water that hadn't been processed by their technology. This wasn't just random behavior. It revealed a fundamental limitation in their sensory capabilities. I quickly gathered as many supplies as I could carry: medical kits, chemical reagents, testing equipment, and tools. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something on a workbench that had been overlooked by previous looters: a portable spectroscopic analyzer, far more advanced than my field kit. This would allow Chen to identify the precise molecular changes being made to the water. The return journey was tense. I took a different route, staying close to a natural spring that flowed through the area. If I needed to hide again, water would be my shield. But I made it back to the facility without another encounter. When I arrived, I found Lucy Chen waiting anxiously at the airlock. "We lost visual on you," she said as she helped me remove the protective suit. "The exterior cameras went down about 20 minutes after you left. We thought—" She didn't finish the sentence. "I encountered one of them," I told her, describing the drone and my discovery about the water. "They can't see through uncontaminated water. It's like they're blind to it." She helped me bring the supplies to the main room where Marcus and Dr. Harrison were waiting. I explained what had happened while Marcus checked me for radiation exposure. "That's consistent with what I observed in the hospital," Marcus said. "The injured people who had been swimming or were caught in rainstorms when the attack began seemed to survive longer before showing symptoms, even if they were closer to contaminated areas." "It makes sense if you think about it," Chen added. "If they evolved in an environment with different water chemistry, they would develop sensory systems optimized for that chemistry. Pure H2O might be practically invisible to them." While they discussed the implications, Darius, who had been quiet since our arrival, approached me. "I saw one of those small ones, too," he said softly, "before the big ships came. It was at the lake, dropping things in the water. I thought it was some kind of research drone." "Did you tell anyone?" I asked. He nodded. "The park ranger. He said it was probably just university researchers, but I snuck back that night with my camera. I got pictures of it." He pulled out his phone, surprisingly still functional. The images clearly showed a device similar to what I'd encountered hovering over Lake Mary at night, releasing small objects that dissolved on contact with the water. "This was 2 weeks ago?" I asked, remembering what he'd said earlier. "Yeah, July 1st. I came back every night that week. They always came after midnight, always dropped the same things in the water. 2 weeks of preparation, seeding our water supply with whatever compounds were needed to begin the transformation process, patiently setting the stage for the main invasion. The nuclear exchange wasn't the beginning. It was just the acceleration of a plan already well underway." Chen examined the spectroscopic analyzer I'd brought back. "With this, we can identify exactly what they're adding to the water. If we know that, we might be able to develop countermeasures." For the first time since the invasion began, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had discovered a weakness in their sensory capabilities. We had equipment that might help us understand their technology, and most importantly, we had found each other, a small team with complementary skills and knowledge. As Chen began analyzing water samples with the new equipment, I pulled up the facility's schematics on the main computer. There was a network of maintenance tunnels that connected to other parts of the municipal water system. If we could navigate those tunnels, we might be able to reach other untainted water sources without exposing ourselves on the surface. "I think I know how we can expand our safe zone," I told the others, pointing to the schematic. and maybe even start fighting back. Little did I know that our first real test was coming sooner than any of us expected. The pressure changes I'd created in the water system had attracted more attention than just the nearby facility. Something larger was now aware of our presence, and it was coming to investigate. As night fell on the second day, I gathered everyone in the control room to explain our municipal water system. Understanding how water flows through our infrastructure was crucial to developing any effective resistance plan. Most people don't realize how complex water management truly is, I began, bringing up schematics on the main screen. What we call our water system is actually multiple interconnected networks that handle different stages of water processing and distribution. I traced the main lines on the digital map, showing how surface water from reservoirs like Lake Mary flowed through treatment facilities before entering municipal distribution networks. I explained how groundwater from wells and aquifers supplemented this supply, particularly during drought conditions. The system was designed with redundancy in mind, I continued. If one source becomes contaminated or a treatment facility fails, we can isolate sections and reroute flow from alternative sources. That's our advantage right now. We can manipulate the system to preserve untainted water and potentially disrupt whatever the aliens are doing. Chen stepped forward, presenting her analysis of the water samples. I've identified the key molecular changes they're making to our water, she said. They're introducing compounds that incorporate radioactive isotopes into stable structures. Essentially, they're creating new molecules that maintain radiation in a form their biology can utilize. Like plants using sunlight for photosynthesis, Dr. Harrison suggested. Similar concept, but with radiation instead of light, Chen agreed. These compounds are highly toxic to us because our biology evolved with mechanisms to protect against radiation, not utilize it. So they need the nuclear radiation to fuel their terraforming, I said, the pieces clicking together. That's why they triggered the nuclear exchange. Exactly. The nuclear detonations weren't just a distraction. They were part of the plan. More radiation means faster and more complete transformation of our water. Marcus added medical context. The symptoms I observed in exposed patients support this theory. Their cells showed signs of attempting to incorporate these new compounds, failing, and then undergoing rapid deterioration. It's like their bodies were trying to adapt, but couldn't. What about the connection to their sensory limitations? I asked, thinking about my experience in the water tank. Chen nodded. That's the fascinating part. These new compounds they're creating emit energy signatures in a specific frequency range. I believe that's how they perceive their environment, by detecting these emissions. Pure water is essentially invisible to them because it doesn't emit in that range. This information gave us our first strategic advantage. We could move undetected through areas with untainted water, or potentially mask our presence by surrounding ourselves with pure water. Here's what we're going to do, I said, outlining our plan. The maintenance tunnels connect to an emergency reservoir 2 miles from here. It's isolated from the main system and should still be untainted. We need to secure that water source and establish a secondary safe location. Diaz marked potential security risks on the tunnel map. If we encounter their drones, we should have containers of pure water ready as camouflage. Once we secure the reservoir, I continued, we can begin implementing a more ambitious plan, redirecting untainted groundwater to create safe zones for other survivors. And what about actually fighting back? Darius asked. We can't just hide forever. That's phase 2, I explained. Chen's analysis shows these new water compounds are stable but potentially vulnerable to certain chemical reactions. If we can develop a counteragent that breaks down these compounds, we might be able to reverse some of their terraforming effects. We'd need access to specific chemicals, Chen cautioned, industrial-grade purifiers, certain catalysts. The main water treatment plant would have those, I said. It's a risk, but we need those supplies. We prepared for our first mission, securing the emergency reservoir. Diaz, Marcus, and I would navigate the maintenance tunnels while Chen continued her analysis with Dr. Harrison's assistance. Darius would monitor communications and alert us to any changes in facility security. The tunnels were cramped, concrete passages barely 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. They carried the main water lines between treatment facilities and provided access for maintenance workers. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim red glow. These tunnels were built during the Cold War, I explained as we made our way forward. Part of the Critical Infrastructure Protection Program. They were designed to maintain water access even after a nuclear attack. Ironic, Marcus muttered. They finally served their purpose, just not against the enemy they were built for. We moved cautiously, checking radiation levels at regular intervals. The tunnels themselves showed minimal contamination, shielded by layers of concrete and earth. After about half a mile, we reached a junction where multiple pipes converged. The main line from Lake Mary comes in here, I said, pointing to a large pipe with monitoring equipment attached. We need to check if the contamination has reached this far into the system. I used my testing kit to sample water from a maintenance valve. The results were alarming. The water already showed signs of molecular alteration, though not as advanced as the samples from the surface. They're moving faster than we thought, I said, showing the others the readings. The contamination is spreading through the entire connected system. Can we isolate the emergency reservoir? Diaz asked. Yes, but we need to reach the control station at the 1-mile marker. From there, we can close the connecting valves and prevent contaminated water from reaching the reservoir. We continued through the tunnels, eventually reaching the control station, a small chamber with valve controls and monitoring equipment. I quickly accessed the system and initiated the isolation protocol, shutting down flow between the main network and the emergency reservoir. That should protect the reservoir for now, I said. Let's keep moving. As we approached the reservoir access point, Marcus's radiation detector began showing unusual readings. Not increasing radiation, a specific pattern of fluctuation that didn't match normal background radiation. Something's not right, he whispered. These aren't natural radiation patterns. We paused, listening. A faint mechanical hum echoed through the tunnel ahead. We'd heard that sound before, one of their drones. Diaz motioned us into a side maintenance alcove as the sound grew louder. From our hiding spot, we watched as a small spherical drone, similar to the one I'd encountered at the warehouse, moved slowly through the tunnel, scanning the walls and pipes. It's looking for the source of the pressure changes, I whispered. It tracked our signal. The drone paused at the control station we'd just used, extending a probe-like appendage to interface with the control panel. It was accessing our system, reading what we'd done. If it finds the reservoir, Marcus said, they'll contaminate that water too. We had to act. I reached for one of the containers of pure water we'd brought, unscrewing the cap as quietly as possible. Our plan was simple but untested. We believed pure water would shield us from their detection, but we hadn't tried actively using it against them. Cover me, I whispered, stepping out of the alcove with the container. The drone immediately turned toward me, its scanning beam locking onto my position. I threw the water directly at its sensory array. The effect was immediate and startling. The drone's movements became erratic, its scanning beam fluctuating wildly as if unable to process what it was detecting. It's working, Diaz hissed. The water is blinding it. While the drone was disoriented, Diaz rushed forward with a heavy pipe wrench, striking the machine with enough force to damage its propulsion system. It crashed to the floor, still active but unable to fly. Marcus quickly emptied another water container over it, causing its systems to short-circuit completely. That confirms Chen's theory, I said, examining the disabled drone. They can't process pure water. It disrupts their sensory systems. We collected the drone for Chen to analyze later, then continued to the reservoir access point. The emergency reservoir was smaller than the main ones, designed to provide short-term water supply during infrastructure repairs. It was contained in a sealed concrete chamber with its own filtration system. I checked the water quality. It was still untainted, free from the molecular alterations we'd seen in the surface water. This was a vital resource, enough clean water to sustain a small group of survivors for weeks. "We need to secure this location," Diaz said, surveying the chamber. "It could serve as a fallback position if the main facility is compromised." We spent an hour setting up basic security measures and establishing an emergency communication link with the main facility. As we worked, Marcus received a call on his emergency radio from Chen. "You need to get back here immediately," she said, her voice urgent. "I've completed the molecular analysis, and it's worse than we thought. The contamination isn't just spreading through connected water systems, it's actively replicating, converting normal water molecules it contacts." "Like a virus?" I asked. "More like a catalyst that triggers a chain reaction. Once it reaches a certain concentration in a water source, the entire body of water begins transforming, and the reaction is accelerating." This changed everything. Isolation wouldn't be enough to protect untainted water sources indefinitely. If even a small amount of contaminated water came in contact with clean sources, the conversion would begin. "There's something else," Chen continued. "I've detected unusual pressure fluctuations in the main water lines. Something large is moving through the municipal system, heading toward our facility." We gathered our equipment and headed back immediately, moving as quickly as we could through the tunnels. When we reached the junction point, we heard it, a loud, rhythmic pulsing coming from the direction of the main water line. Something was moving through the pipe itself, something much larger than the drone we'd encountered. "Run," Diaz said simply. We sprinted through the tunnels, the pulsing sound growing louder behind us. When we finally reached the facility access door, we could feel vibrations through the concrete floor. Whatever was coming was almost at our position. We sealed the heavy door behind us, engaging all security locks. The monitoring system showed rapidly changing pressure readings in the water lines connected to our facility. Something was probing our system, testing for weaknesses. Back in the control room, Chen was monitoring the situation with growing alarm. "The pressure pattern suggests it's trying to force contaminated water into our clean supply. If it succeeds, our entire facility water system will be compromised." "Can we cut off all external water connections?" Marcus asked. I shook my head. We'd lose pressure in our fire suppression systems, and the facility wasn't designed to operate completely isolated. We need water flow to maintain environmental systems. "What about the reverse?" Dr. Harrison suggested. "Instead of trying to keep it out, what if we send something out to disrupt it?" Chen's eyes widened. "The counteragent. My analysis shows certain compounds might disrupt the molecular conversion process. We don't have enough to treat large water bodies, but we might have enough to create a localized effect." "Like an antibody fighting an infection," Marcus said. "Exactly. We introduce our counteragent into the water line where this thing is probing. It might not stop it, but it could slow it down enough for us to implement a more permanent solution." We quickly assembled a makeshift injection system using the facility's chemical treatment equipment, preparing to introduce Chen's experimental counteragent into the exact point where the alien probe was attempting to access our water system. "Ready?" I asked, hand poised over the control. Chen nodded. "Remember, this is just a stopgap. We don't know how it will react." I activated the injection system. Chemical analyzers showed our counteragent entering the water line and meeting the contaminated water at the junction point. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then the pressure readings went haywire. "It's working," I said, watching the monitors. "The counteragent is disrupting whatever process they're using." The pulsing sounds from the water lines changed, becoming irregular and then stopping completely. The pressure readings stabilized, then showed a rapid withdrawal. Whatever had been probing our system was retreating. "We actually heard it," Darius said, amazement in his voice. "Temporarily," Chen cautioned. "We've discovered a defensive measure, but we don't have enough of the counteragent to protect all our water sources. And they'll adapt." She was right. We'd won a small victory, but the wider situation remained dire. The aliens were systematically transforming Earth's water, and we had only managed to protect our tiny corner. But we had proven something crucial. They weren't invincible. Their technology had vulnerabilities that we could exploit. As night turned to early morning, we gathered again to reassess our situation. The pressure changes in our water system had unexpectedly provided valuable intelligence. The aliens clearly monitored water systems with remarkable sensitivity. They could detect manipulations in pressure, flow, and composition, which suggested water was even more central to their biology and technology than we'd initially thought. "They aren't just terraforming for eventual colonization," Chen proposed, studying the data from our encounter. "I think they're actually living in our water systems now, using them as both habitat and transportation network. Like our infrastructure is becoming their circulatory system," Marcus suggested. "That explains their rapid deployment across the globe," I added. "They're not flying or walking from place to place, they're flowing through our own water networks." This realization opened new strategic possibilities. If they were using our water infrastructure to move and communicate, we could potentially use that same infrastructure against them. We could introduce counteragents at key junction points, disrupting their movements and communications. But first, we needed more of the counteragent, which required specific chemicals from the main water treatment plant. And we knew from Sergeant Diaz that alien craft had already secured that facility. "We need to infiltrate the treatment plant," I said, knowing how dangerous it would sound. "It's the only way to get the chemicals we need in sufficient quantities." "That's suicide," Diaz objected. "You saw what happened to my unit when we engaged them directly." "We're not going to engage," I clarified. "We're going to use what we've learned about their sensory limitations. Pure water blinds them. We use that to our advantage. Create a diversion with water while a small team infiltrates the plant." It was a desperate plan, but we had no alternatives. Without those chemicals, we couldn't produce more counteragent. Without the counteragent, we couldn't protect our remaining clean water sources or disrupt their terraforming process. "I'll go," I said. "I know the treatment plant layout better than anyone. Chen can guide me to the specific chemicals we need." "Not alone," Diaz said firmly. "I'm coming with you. My tactical training will be useful." "I should go too," Marcus added. "If either of you is exposed to contaminated water, immediate medical treatment could be crucial." We spent the rest of that night planning the mission, studying facility layouts and preparing equipment. We would move at dawn, using the maintenance tunnels to approach the treatment plant from below, hopefully avoiding the alien craft Diaz had seen on the surface. What we didn't know then was that our small victory had attracted attention far beyond the local alien presence. Our counteragent had done more than just repel the probe. It had disrupted a node in their network, causing a cascade effect that registered throughout their entire water-based communication system. We had become more than just an annoyance. We were now a priority target. We took shelter in an abandoned mine shaft after our hasty retreat from the main facility. The aliens had responded to our counteragent more aggressively than we anticipated. They hadn't just sent another probe, they dispatched what Diaz called a harvester, a larger entity that moved through the water systems with frightening speed and precision. The mine connected to a deep limestone aquifer, one of the isolated water sources Dr. Harrison had identified on his geological maps. The water here remained untainted, shielded from surface contamination by layers of impermeable rock. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe, at least temporarily. "I still can't believe we had to abandon the facility," Marcus said, setting up a makeshift medical station in one corner of our new hideout. The loss weighed heavily on all of us. We'd left in such haste that we could only grab essential equipment and supplies. "We didn't have a choice," I reminded him. "When their harvester breached the main water line, we had minutes before contamination would have reached our internal systems. At least everyone got out safely." That wasn't entirely true. We had lost someone during our escape, an older man named Collins who had arrived seeking shelter just the day before. He'd been separated from the group during our evacuation through the emergency tunnels. Diaz had gone back for him but found only empty tunnels, water pooling on the floor where Collins had been standing. The aliens weren't just changing our water anymore. They were taking people. "I've been analyzing the water samples we managed to bring," Chen said, looking up from her portable testing equipment. "The progression of molecular changes is accelerating. What took hours at the beginning of the invasion now happens in minutes." "They're getting more efficient," I observed. "Not just efficient, adapted. The molecular structures are becoming more complex, more stable. It's like they're refining their process with each water source they convert." Marcus shared equally concerning medical news. "The symptoms in exposed individuals are changing too. The early cases died quickly, 12 to 24 hours after exposure. But reports from other medical facilities before communications went down described longer survival times with more extensive physiological changes." "What kind of changes?" Dr. Harrison asked. Marcus hesitated. "Cellular restructuring, tissue transformation. The victims remained conscious longer, aware of what was happening to them. Their bodies were being systematically altered at a molecular level." "They're not just terraforming the water," Chen said quietly. "They're trying to terraform us." The implications were horrifying. These weren't just invaders seeking to eliminate humans and take our planet. They were attempting to convert Earth's entire biosphere, including its inhabitants, into something compatible with their biology. Darius, who had been unusually quiet since our evacuation, spoke up. "That's what happened to my friend Tyler. He fell into the lake after those things appeared. When they pulled him out, his skin had started turning bluish and transparent in patches. He was still talking, still conscious, but he said he could feel something moving through his body." "Did he survive?" I asked gently. Darius shook his head. "Not as himself. The doctors quarantined him. The next day he broke out of the hospital. No one could find him. They thought he'd died somewhere, but I saw him 2 days later near the lake. He was different, moved weird, wouldn't respond when I called out. He was going back to the water." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Collins hadn't just died in those tunnels. He'd been taken, converted, like Tyler, and who knew how many others. We needed to refocus on what we could control. I spread out our map of the regional water system, identifying our current position and potential routes to the water treatment plant we needed to infiltrate. "The good news is we're closer to the plant from here than we were at the facility," I said. "These old mining tunnels actually intersect with the municipal water tunnels about half a mile from our position." I needed to speak with Maya and Sarah immediately, but first I had to play along. "Well, I'm glad he did. This place is a godsend compared to what we've been through." Abram smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're selective about who joins us. Resources are limited, and everyone must contribute. Not everyone in your group may have skills we need." There it was, the implied threat. Not everyone would be welcome here. I thought of Michael's son, still weak from his injury, or Dr. Hoffman with his advanced age. Would they be deemed useful enough? Everyone in our group has value, I said firmly. We stay together. Abrams shrugged. That's not how things work here. But we'll discuss it tomorrow. For now, enjoy our hospitality. When I finally found Maya alone, I explained what I'd discovered. Her expression shifted from shock to anger. He deliberately sabotaged us, got that family captured or killed? I don't think he meant for that to happen, I said, trying to be fair despite my own anger. He probably planned for us to come here all along, not realizing the raiders would intercept us. We need to warn the others, she insisted. Carefully, I cautioned. We don't know who else might be working with Carlos. We gathered our most trusted people, Sarah, Amir, and Dr. Hoffman, in the school's greenhouse where we could speak privately under the noise of ventilation fans. Their reactions mirrored Maya's initial shock. What's his endgame? Sarah asked. Why betray us like this? Survival, Dr. Hoffman suggested grimly. He's securing his position here by bringing them valuable assets, namely, Zeke's expertise. And what happens to those of us they don't want? Amir asked the question we were all thinking. I had no good answer. We need to be ready to leave quickly if necessary. Check the vehicles. Gather what supplies you can without arousing suspicion. We may need to move tonight. As we dispersed, I sought out Carlos, finding him in the school cafeteria with several of Abrams's security team. They were sharing a bottle of something that appeared to be homemade alcohol, laughing like old friends. Zeke, Carlos called, noticing me. Come join us. We're celebrating your success with the water system. I forced a smile and sat down. Thanks for connecting us with this place. It's quite an operation they have here. Better than dying of radiation poisoning on the road to a mythical safe zone, right? He passed me the bottle, which I pretended to drink from. About that, I said casually. Abrams mentioned you radioed ahead. When did you get a radio? Carlos's expression tightened momentarily before he recovered. Found one in the warehouse group's supplies. Thought it might be useful to scout ahead. Without telling the rest of us, he leaned in, lowering his voice. I was trying to ensure our survival, Zeke. Something you should understand. By stealing crucial parts from our water system. Parts that might have saved Michael's family? A flash of guilt crossed his face. That wasn't supposed to happen. The raiders weren't supposed to be there. But they were, and now a family is dead or captured because of your secret plan. Carlos's companions were watching our exchange with increasing interest. He stood abruptly. Let's talk about this elsewhere. We walked to a deserted classroom, the tension between us palpable. As soon as the door closed, Carlos turned on me. You don't understand what I've arranged here. This place has real security, real resources. I made sure we'd have a place here. We? Or just you? All of us who are useful, he replied, confirming my fears. Look, this is the new world. Sentimentality gets you killed. They can't support dead weight. And who decides who's dead weight? Abrams? You? Carlos ran a hand through his hair in frustration. You're not seeing the big picture. These people have connections to the military. They know what's happening outside. Flagstaff is overrun with refugees. The military is turning people away. This is our best option now. What have you promised them, Carlos? What else besides my water expertise? His hesitation told me everything. They need Maya's agricultural knowledge, too, and Amir's technical skills. The others, well, they can earn their keep or move on. Move on? Into a radioactive wasteland with no supplies or protection? That's a death sentence, and you know it. It's not my problem, he said, but couldn't meet my eyes. I did what I had to do to secure our future. Not our future. Your future. I moved toward the door, and I won't be part of it. Don't be stupid, Zeke. He grabbed my arm. Where will you go? Your hand needs medical treatment. You won't last a week out there. I pulled away. Better to die free than live as part of whatever this is. As I returned to our assigned quarters, I saw Director Abrams watching me from across the courtyard, his expression calculating. He'd been observing our confrontation, probably had people listening. Our timeline for leaving had just accelerated dramatically. I found Maya packing essential supplies into a small bag. We need to leave tonight, I told her. Carlos has sold us out. Only those with useful skills will be allowed to stay. What about the others? Dr. Hoffman? Michael's son? We take everyone who wants to come. I won't leave anyone behind again. Word spread quietly among our group. Some, like Tina and Jackson, decided to take their chances at the compound. They had formed connections with the community members and believed they could prove their value. The rest, Maya, Sarah, Amir, Dr. Hoffman, Michael's son, and 3 others from the warehouse group, prepared for a midnight escape. Our plan was simple but dangerous. Sarah and 2 of her people would create a distraction at the north end of the compound. During the confusion, the rest of us would take my truck and slip out the maintenance gate where security was lighter. We would meet up at a designated point 2 miles east. As midnight approached, I made a final check of our supplies. We had minimal food, my semi-repaired water filtration system with the recovered parts I'd secretly removed from their system, and basic medical supplies. It wasn't much for the journey ahead, but it was better than abandoning our people to an uncertain fate. The distraction went as planned. A small fire in an unused storage building, just enough to draw attention without causing real damage. In the confusion, we moved quickly to the maintenance gate. The single guard was easily convinced to look the other way when Maya offered him precious medicine. We drove with headlights off until we were well clear of the compound, then headed toward our rendezvous point. Relief washed over me when we spotted Sarah and her companions waiting safely. "Any pursuit?" I asked as they climbed into the already crowded truck. "Not yet," Sarah replied, "but they'll know by morning." We drove through the night, pushing northeast toward Flagstaff once again. Despite Carlos's claims that it was overrun, it remained our best hope for proper medical care and security. My hand was getting worse, the radiation burn spreading up my arm with increasing pain. Dr. Hoffman administered what painkillers we had, but his expression was grim as he examined the spreading lesions. By dawn, we were 40 miles from the compound and thoroughly exhausted. We found shelter in an abandoned ranch house set back from the road, its previous occupants long gone but much of the structure intact. While the others secured the perimeter and set up a temporary camp, I worked on reinstalling the stolen components into my filtration system. "Will it work properly now?" Maya asked, watching me work despite her exhaustion. "It should," I replied. "Not as efficient as before, but enough to make the contaminated water safe for drinking." The system took hours to set up properly, but by mid-afternoon, we had our first batch of truly clean water since leaving the facility. It wasn't much, barely 2 liters, but the psychological impact was enormous. Clean water meant hope, meant survival. Dr. Hoffman used some to properly clean my radiation burns, applying antibiotic ointment from our limited supplies. This will help with infection, but the radiation damage is beyond what we can treat here. You need proper medical care, Zeke. I nodded, accepting the reality. All the more reason to reach Flagstaff. We spent 2 days at the ranch house, recovering our strength and processing enough water for the journey ahead. During that time, Amir managed to repair a ham radio he'd found in the house, allowing us to scan for broadcasts. Most frequencies were dead, but on the second day we picked up a military transmission with coordinates and instructions for refugees. The message confirmed what we'd hoped. A functional military installation outside Flagstaff was accepting civilians with critical skills. Just like the compound, Dr. Hoffman noted grimly, only accepting the useful ones. The difference is we stay together, I insisted. Whatever happens, we present ourselves as a unit with complementary skills. No one gets left behind. The broadcast also included a warning that made my blood run cold. Raiders were operating along the major routes into Flagstaff, targeting refugee groups. The military advised extreme caution and traveling in groups for protection. We need more people, Sarah suggested. Safety in numbers. More people means more water, more food, more complexity, I countered. We barely have enough for ourselves. But we have skills others need, Maya pointed out. Your water filtration, my agricultural knowledge. We could trade expertise for protection. It was a compelling argument, and after discussion, we agreed to cautiously approach other refugee groups we encountered, offering alliance rather than competition. Our opportunity came the next day as we prepared to depart. A convoy of 3 vehicles approached the ranch from the south, too organized to be raiders, too cautious to be military. We watched them through binoculars as they stopped a quarter-mile away, clearly checking us out as well. After tense observation, they sent a single representative, a woman in her 50s carrying a white flag. We sent Maya to meet her halfway, while I watched with Amir's hunting rifle, ready if things went bad. The conversation lasted several minutes before both women returned to the ranch house. The newcomer introduced herself as Eleanor, a former emergency management official who now led a group of 17 survivors heading for Flagstaff. We have food and weapons, she explained, but our water situation is critical. 2 of our people are showing signs of radiation poisoning from contaminated water. It was the perfect complementary situation. We needed protection and additional transportation. They needed clean water and medical knowledge. After extensive discussion and security precautions, our groups merged, creating a more formidable convoy of 4 vehicles and 27 people. Eleanor's group included several with military or law enforcement backgrounds, significantly improving our security. They had established communication protocols, defensive formations for camping, and intelligence about the routes ahead. In exchange, I set up my filtration system in their largest vehicle, creating a mobile water processing unit. With our combined resources and knowledge, the journey seemed more viable. We departed the next morning in a careful convoy formation, moving northeast along secondary roads toward Flagstaff. The military broadcast had indicated the installation was approximately 80 miles from our location, 3 days' journey at our cautious pace. The merged group dynamic was challenging at first. Trust came slowly, with both sides maintaining separate leadership and decision-making. Eleanor and I served as the primary liaisons, working to integrate our procedures and resources without either group feeling dominated. My radiation burns continued to worsen despite Dr. Hoffman's best efforts. The pain was constant now, requiring regular medication that made me drowsy and less effective. Maya increasingly took over my water system duties, learning the technical aspects with remarkable speed. You need to conserve your strength, she insisted when I tried to maintain my regular work schedule. We'll need you at full capacity when we reach Flagstaff. On the second day of our combined journey, we encountered our first major obstacle, a military checkpoint on the highway leading north. From a distance, it appeared to be a legitimate operation with proper vehicles and uniformed personnel. Eleanor's security expert, a former sheriff named Ray, was suspicious. It's too small for an official checkpoint, and it's not at a strategic location. Could be disguised raiders. We observed for hours, watching how they processed the few vehicles that approached. Some were turned away, some were allowed through, and some particularly those that appeared well supplied, were directed to a holding area out of sight. "They're filtering," Ray concluded, "taking what they want and who they want." "Legitimate military?" I asked. "Possibly, but operating outside standard protocols. Maybe a splinter unit, maybe deserters using their equipment to set up their own operation. We couldn't risk the checkpoint, but going around would add days to our journey." After consultation between our leadership groups, we developed a new plan. We would split our convoy, with the most defensible vehicles creating a diversion, while the others slipped through on a parallel service road. I insisted on going with the diversion team despite my condition. My truck was one of our most capable off-road vehicles, and I knew its limitations best. Maya objected strenuously, but I was resolute. "I got us into this. I'm not sitting back while others take the risk." The plan worked, but just barely. The diversion team, my truck and Eleanor's reinforced SUV, approached the checkpoint openly, then veered off at the last moment, drawing pursuit into the rough terrain where our vehicles had the advantage. Meanwhile, the others slipped past on the service road, disappearing into the hills beyond. The pursuit was more determined than we'd anticipated. 2 military-style vehicles followed us for miles through increasingly difficult terrain. When one got too close, Ray used the hunting rifle to take out a tire, sending it careening into a ditch. We eventually lost the second pursuer in a narrow canyon where their larger vehicle couldn't follow, then doubled back toward our rendezvous point using a circuitous route to ensure we weren't followed. The reunion with the rest of our convoy was emotional and relieved. We'd all made it through, though not without cost. My condition had deteriorated significantly during the high-stress operation, the pain now radiating through my entire arm and into my shoulder. Dr. Hoffman's expression was grave as he checked my burns that evening. "The tissue damage is extensive. I'm concerned about systemic absorption of radioactive material." "How long do I have?" I asked directly. "Without proper treatment. Days before permanent damage, perhaps a week before organ systems begin to fail." He hesitated. "We need to reach Flagstaff immediately." The news wasn't entirely unexpected, but hearing it stated so explicitly focused my mind. We were still at least a day from the military installation, assuming no further delays. I had to hold on, had to get our people to safety. That night, as I drifted in and out of a fever-induced haze, Maya stayed by my side, changing the cool compresses on my forehead. "We're going to make it," she promised. "We've come too far to fail now." I wanted to believe her, but the pain in my arm and the fire in my veins made optimism difficult. As dawn approached, bringing day 65 since the bombs fell, I wondered if I would live to see our journey completed, whether I would survive to help build whatever came after the dust settled. Morning came with new complications. My fever had spiked overnight, and Dr. Hoffman's face was grim as he examined me. "The infection is spreading rapidly," he told Maya, not bothering to lower his voice. "We need antibiotics, proper antibiotics, not just the limited supply we have." Eleanor joined the conversation, her practical nature asserting itself. "We need to keep moving. How long can he travel in this condition?" "He shouldn't be traveling at all," Dr. Hoffman replied sharply, "but we have no choice." They fashioned a makeshift bed in the back of Eleanor's SUV, transferring me from my truck. Maya would drive my vehicle, with Ray taking over security coordination. I tried to protest, to insist I could still contribute, but my body betrayed me. The moment they laid me down, unconsciousness claimed me. I drifted in and out of awareness as we traveled. Occasional lucid moments punctuated by long stretches of fever dreams. In those brief periods of clarity, I gathered that we were making good progress, that the terrain was becoming more favorable, that Flagstaff might be just hours away. But I also caught the worried glances, the whispered consultations between Dr. Hoffman and Eleanor. At some point, the convoy stopped. Voices became urgent, movements hurried. I forced myself to focus to push through the fog of fever. Maya was beside me, her face tight with concern. "What's happening?" I managed to ask. "A roadblock ahead," she explained, "but different from the last one. Proper military vehicles, established perimeter. Eleanor thinks it's the real thing, the Flagstaff security zone." Hope flared briefly, but reality asserted itself quickly. "They'll have screening protocols, radiation detection." Maya nodded, understanding my concern. With my level of contamination, I might be denied entry, quarantined, or worse. Dr. Hoffman has a plan. He's negotiating now. I drifted again, the conversation fading as my consciousness ebbed. When I next became aware, we were moving once more, but in a different vehicle, larger, with the unmistakable rumble of military-grade engines. A medic in proper protective gear was inserting an IV into my unaffected arm. "You're going to be okay," they said through their mask. "We're taking you to the medical center." The decontamination process was a blur of painful procedures. They cut away my clothing, scrubbed my skin with special solutions, administered medications that made me violently ill. But the proper treatment for the radiation burns began immediately. Specialized dressings, steroids, antibiotics, and painkillers that finally dulled the fire in my arm. I learned later that Dr. Hoffman had leveraged his medical credentials to convince the military checkpoint to accept our entire group, emphasizing the valuable skills we brought. Maya's agricultural expertise, my water engineering knowledge, Eleanor's emergency management experience, all assets in rebuilding efforts. Days passed in the medical facility, my condition slowly stabilizing. The burns would leave permanent scarring, and some nerve damage was inevitable, but the doctors were cautiously optimistic that I would keep the arm and eventually regain most function. On my 5th day in the medical center, Maya brought unexpected visitors, Carlos and Director Abrams. They had arrived at the Flagstaff checkpoint the previous day, part of a larger convoy from the school compound. "The raiders came," Carlos explained, his expression haunted. "3 days after you left. They had overwhelming force. The compound defenses didn't hold." Abrams looked diminished somehow, his authoritative presence reduced. "Many didn't make it. We lost almost half our people in the initial attack. Those of us who escaped have been on the road since." I felt conflicted seeing them, anger at their earlier betrayal warring with sympathy for their current situation. "What happens now?" I asked. "The military has integrated us into the refugee population," Abrams replied. "Our skills are being assessed for assignment to recovery teams." "And Tina and Jackson? The others who stayed behind?" Carlos looked away. "Tina made it out. Jackson didn't." The news hit hard. Whatever his faults, Jackson had been part of our original group, had survived the initial attacks with us. His loss felt personal. Carlos lingered after Abrams left. "I was wrong," he said finally, "about everything. The compound wasn't safety. It was just another trap. You were right to leave when you did." "It wasn't about being right," I told him. "It was about not abandoning people who depended on us." He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "I need to live with what I did. The family we lost, Jackson, the others, that's on me." There was nothing I could say to ease that burden, nor was I inclined to try. His actions had cost lives, but I recognized the beginning of genuine remorse in his expression, perhaps the first step toward whatever redemption was possible in this new world. As my recovery progressed, I began to learn more about the Flagstaff operation. The military had established a significant presence, creating a secure zone around the city and surrounding areas. Radiation levels were monitored constantly, with cleanup efforts focused on making more areas habitable. Civilian specialists were being organized into recovery teams based on their skills. Maya visited daily, bringing news of her new role coordinating agricultural initiatives. Her expertise in hydroponics had earned her a leadership position in food production efforts. Dr. Hoffman was working in the medical center, his experience invaluable despite his age. Even Michael's son had found purpose as an assistant in the communications center. By the time I was deemed well enough for discharge, day 78. Since the bombs fell, I'd already been approached about joining the water infrastructure team. My experience with radiation-resistant filtration systems was exactly what they needed for expanding the safe zone. The living quarters assigned to me were Spartan but clean, a small apartment in a converted hotel near the city center. The window overlooked a courtyard where children played under the watchful eyes of armed guards. This strange juxtaposition, normalcy alongside constant vigilance, defined life in Flagstaff. My first task with the infrastructure team was assessing the city's existing water treatment facilities. Much of the equipment had survived intact, but radiation contamination in the watershed presented significant challenges. I found myself drawing on everything I'd learned during our journey, improvising with limited resources, maximizing efficiency, prioritizing safety. 2 weeks into my new role, I was called to a meeting with the military commander overseeing the Flagstaff recovery operation. Colonel Reeves was a career officer with extensive experience in disaster response, now tasked with rebuilding civilization in this corner of Arizona. "Your work on the water systems has been noticed," he said without preamble. "We're planning to establish additional outposts in less contaminated areas. Each will need sustainable water infrastructure." "The technology exists," I replied. "With proper filtration and recycling, even moderately contaminated sources can be made safe. The challenge is scaling up production of the necessary components." The colonel nodded. "That's where your experience at the hydroponics facility comes in. We've been reviewing your background. Prison water systems, desert conservation techniques, improvised filtration during your journey here. You've demonstrated remarkable adaptability." What he was proposing became clear. Not just maintaining Flagstaff's water systems, but developing standardized approaches that could be implemented across multiple recovery zones, creating the infrastructure for rebuilding on a larger scale. "I'll need a team," I said, "and access to manufacturing facilities." "You'll have both," he assured me, "including anyone from your original group you want to bring in." That evening, I gathered Maya, Sarah, Amir, and Dr. Hoffman in my small apartment to discuss the proposal. The opportunity was significant. Not just survival now, but actively shaping what came next. "It won't be easy," I cautioned. "We'll be working with limited resources, dealing with contamination issues we don't fully understand yet. And the military will have their own agenda." "Better than dying of thirst in the desert," Amir pointed out pragmatically. Maya's perspective was more nuanced. "We need to ensure our work benefits everyone, not just those the military deems valuable. No more compounds with selective admission." Dr. Hoffman, who had seen more of life than any of us, added his wisdom. "In times of rebuilding, those who control essential resources shape the society that emerges. Water, food, medicine, these become the foundations of power. We must use that influence responsibly." His words resonated deeply. In the prison system, I'd seen how water access was weaponized, used as control. In our journey, I'd witnessed how quickly people reverted to tribal mentalities when resources became scarce. Now, we had the opportunity to establish systems based on different principles. Then we accept, I decided, but we set our own conditions. We work as a team, we share our knowledge widely rather than hoarding it, and we prioritize sustainability over short-term gains. The others agreed, each bringing their own expertise to what would become the Watershed Initiative, our name for the water infrastructure project that would eventually extend far beyond Flagstaff. In the months that followed, we developed standardized filtration systems that could be assembled from readily available components. Maya integrated water conservation into her agricultural models. Sarah organized training programs for communities to maintain their own systems. Dr. Hoffman researched the long-term health impacts of various purification methods. Carlos, seeking his own redemption, volunteered to lead expeditions to recover equipment from abandoned facilities. His knowledge of security protocols proved valuable, though trust rebuilt slowly between us. His efforts to locate and identify remains of those lost during our journey, including Michael's family, provided some closure for the survivors. By day 89, our first satellite outpost was operational, a small community 50 miles from Flagstaff with its own secure water supply and beginning agricultural production. It wasn't much, just 30 people in repurposed buildings with basic amenities, but it represented something profound: expansion rather than mere survival. As I stood watching clean water flow from the completed filtration system, I thought about how far we'd come from those first desperate days after the bombs fell. The radiation burns on my arm had healed into a web of scarring that limited my range of motion, but served as a constant reminder of our journey. Someone approached from behind. Michael's son, now going by his own name, David, rather than being defined by his lost family. He had grown in the months since our arrival, taking on responsibilities beyond his years. "They're saying you figured out how to reclaim contaminated reservoirs," he said, watching the water flow. "That it could quadruple our clean water access." I nodded. The radiation levels are dropping in some areas faster than predicted. With proper filtration, we can make use of surface water again, not just deep wells. "That changes everything," he observed quietly. "More water means more food production, more settlements, more rebuilding." He was right. Water was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. My specialized knowledge, once just a job, then a survival tool, had become instrumental in recreating society. "They're sending me out with the next expansion team," David continued. "Communications specialist. I wanted to thank you before I left, for not leaving me behind when my family was taken, for making sure I got here." The simple gratitude caught me off guard. In the chaos of survival, it was easy to forget the human impact of our decisions. "You never needed special protection," I told him honestly. "You earned your place by contributing, just like everyone else." He smiled slightly. "That's what Maya said you'd say." After a moment he added, "I've been monitoring radio frequencies across the region. There are more survivors out there than anyone realized. Organized groups sending out signals, looking to connect." This was new information, hopeful information. "Have you reported this to Colonel Reeves?" David nodded. "That's why they're sending me with the expansion team. To set up proper communications, try to establish contact with these other groups." The implications were profound. We weren't alone in rebuilding. Across the radioactive wasteland, other pockets of civilization were emerging, other groups finding their way forward. Eventually, these isolated communities might reconnect, share resources and knowledge, create something larger than mere survival. As David left to prepare for his mission, I turned back to the flowing water. 90 days since the bombs fell. 90 days of adaptation, loss, struggle, and gradually renewal. The world would never return to what it had been, but something new was emerging from the radioactive dust, something that might, with careful stewardship, become worthy of the sacrifice it had taken to reach this point. My specialized knowledge had saved lives, including my own. But it was the collective skills of our diverse group, Maya's agricultural expertise, Sarah's organizational abilities, Amir's technical knowledge, Dr. Hoffman's medical experience, even Carlos's security background, that had created the foundation for what came next. Water would flow, crops would grow, communities would rebuild, and we would remember both what we had lost and what we had learned in those crucial first 90 days after the world ended. Standing here on day 90, looking out over what we've built, I can hardly believe how far we've come. The Flagstaff Recovery Zone has expanded to encompass 3 satellite communities, each with functioning water systems that I helped design. Our population has grown to over 3,000, with new refugees arriving weekly as word spreads about our success. The military presence remains significant, but has evolved from purely security-focused to actively supporting reconstruction efforts. Colonel Reeves has proven to be a pragmatic leader, willing to incorporate civilian expertise into decision-making. The rigid hierarchy I feared hasn't materialized. Necessity has fostered a more collaborative approach. My role has expanded beyond water systems to overall infrastructure planning. The skills that once seemed specialized, designing closed-loop systems for prisons, maximizing efficiency in desert environments, are now central to rebuilding. My team includes engineers, technicians, and trainees from among the refugee population, all working to expand our water processing capacity. Maya's agricultural division has transformed abandoned buildings and vacant lots into productive growing spaces. Her hydroponic systems, refined from our facility designs, produce fresh vegetables even as winter approaches. More importantly, she's training others, spreading the knowledge rather than centralizing it. This morning, I visited her newest project, a massive greenhouse complex constructed from salvaged materials on the edge of town. Dozens of workers moved between rows of thriving plants, harvesting leafy greens and early root vegetables. Maya spotted me from across the space and made her way over, clipboard in hand and a smudge of soil on her cheek. "The new water recycling system is exceeding expectations," she said by way of greeting, always focused on results. 97% efficiency, just like you predicted. "The filtration modifications are working well then?" She nodded, allowing herself a small smile. "We're producing enough to increase rations next week. Fresh vegetables for everyone, not just children and medical cases." Such a simple statement, but it represented a monumental achievement. For months, fresh produce had been strictly rationed, reserved for those most vulnerable to nutritional deficiencies. Expanding access to the entire population marked a transition from mere survival to something approaching normalcy. Sarah joined us, having spotted our meeting from her nearby administrative center. Once a warehouse group survivor, she now coordinated resource distribution throughout the recovery zone with remarkable efficiency. "Have you heard the latest from David?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not since last week's transmission." "His team has made contact with a significant settlement near what used to be Sedona," she reported. "Several hundred survivors with a functional solar array and rainwater collection, but struggling with contamination issues. They're sending representatives here next week." This was increasingly common. Other survivor groups reaching out after hearing our radio broadcasts. Some came seeking refuge. Others wanted technical assistance to improve their own settlements. And a few sought to establish trade relationships. Each new connection expanded our understanding of what remained of the world beyond our immediate area. Dr. Hoffman had established a medical training program, passing on his knowledge to a new generation of healthcare providers. Without access to traditional medical schools, he adapted, creating an apprenticeship system that combined practical experience with structured learning, using salvaged textbooks and medical supplies. Even Carlos had found a constructive role. After months of security work that kept him at the periphery of our community, he'd volunteered for a more direct contribution, leading expeditions to locate and recover specialized equipment from abandoned facilities. His knowledge of security systems and his tactical skills made these missions more successful, gradually rebuilding trust that his earlier betrayal had shattered. I hadn't forgiven him entirely. I don't think any of us had. But in this new world, grudges were luxuries we couldn't afford. His contributions were valuable, and his remorse appeared genuine. The man who had once prioritized his own survival above all else now routinely took significant personal risks to benefit the community. As for me, the radiation burns had left their mark. My left arm remained weakened, covered in a web of scar tissue that pulled uncomfortably when I moved. The doctors had done what they could, but some damage was permanent. I'd adapted, learning to work around the limitations, using my custom multi-tool with my right hand now instead of my dominant left. The physical reminder of those desperate days served a purpose, keeping me grounded in the reality of what we'd survived. On difficult days when bureaucracy or resource limitations frustrated our efforts, I only needed to glance at my scarred arm to remember how far we'd come from that first morning when the sirens wailed. Today marked a significant milestone in our recovery efforts. After weeks of preparation, we were activating a newly reclaimed reservoir that would double our water capacity. The radiation levels had decreased sufficiently to allow safe processing with our advanced filtration system. The ceremony was modest. Colonel Reeves said a few words about progress and resilience. I explained the technical achievements in layman's terms, and then we officially opened the valves. Water flowed into our treatment facility, clear and abundant. The small crowd applauded, but the true significance wasn't in the ceremony itself, but what it represented. Infrastructure rebuilding on a scale that suggested permanence. Afterward, Colonel Reeves pulled me aside for a private conversation. "The success of this project changes our strategic position," he said, ever the military man, even when discussing civilian matters. "With secure water access at this level, we can support significant population growth." "The filtration system can scale up further," I confirmed. "With proper maintenance, this reservoir could support 10,000 people, maybe more." He nodded thoughtfully. "We've received new intelligence from military command. Other recovery zones are being established across the country, some larger than ours, some smaller. The goal is to create a network of sustainable communities that can eventually reconnect." This was the first concrete information we'd received about nationwide recovery efforts. Until now, our focus had been necessarily local, with only vague rumors about what might be happening elsewhere. "How are they determining where to establish these zones?" I asked. "Resources, geography, contamination levels," he replied, "and existing success. Flagstaff has been designated a primary node because of what we've accomplished here." The implications were significant. Our work wasn't just about local survival anymore. It was part of a larger strategy for national recovery. The systems we developed here would be replicated elsewhere, potentially helping thousands more survivors. "There's something else," the colonel continued. "Command wants detailed documentation of your water filtration methods. They're sending a specialist team to work with you on creating standardized plans that can be implemented in other zones." I felt a surge of professional pride, quickly tempered by practical concerns. "Some of our methods are improvised, adapted to our specific circumstances. They may not translate directly to other environments." "That's precisely why they want your input," he countered. "You've demonstrated exceptional adaptability. The ability to work with whatever resources are available is more valuable than textbook solutions right now." As we walked back toward the center of town, I saw Michael's son, David, approaching. He had returned from his latest communication mission the previous day, having successfully established radio contact with 3 more survivor communities in the region. "Zeke," He called, his expression urgent. "We just received a transmission you need to hear." I followed him to the communications center, a repurposed office building filled with salvaged and repaired radio equipment. He led me to a private room where a recorded message waited. It came in on one of the emergency frequencies, he explained, addressed specifically to the water engineer from the Phoenix hydroponics facility. My pulse quickened. No one should know me by that description except our original group and those we'd encountered on our journey. David played the recording. Through the static, I recognized the voice immediately. Sarah from the warehouse group, the woman who had first approached our facility all those weeks ago. "This is Sarah Miller broadcasting to the water engineer from the Phoenix hydroponics facility. We survived the raider attack on the compound, but were separated from your group. We've established a secure location at coordinates to follow. We have critical information about contamination patterns that affects your water reclamation efforts. Please respond on this frequency if you receive this message." David watched my reaction carefully. "Do you trust this?" I considered the question seriously. Sarah was straightforward in our dealings. She had opportunities to betray us and didn't. But that doesn't mean this isn't a trap. Raiders have become more sophisticated in their methods. "The coordinates are approximately 60 miles southwest of here," he noted. "Satellite imagery shows a small settlement in a defensible position. Could be legitimate. Or could be raiders who captured Sarah and forced this transmission," I countered. The decision wasn't mine alone. I took the recording to our informal leadership council, Maya, Dr. Hoffman, Colonel Reeves, and several others who had emerged as community leaders. After extensive debate, we agreed on a cautious approach. A small team would investigate, properly armed and with military backup, while maintaining communication with Flagstaff. I insisted on being part of the team despite concerns about my injured arm. "I know Sarah. I'll recognize if she's under duress or if something doesn't add up." 3 days later, our small convoy approached the coordinates cautiously. What we found appeared legitimate. A small community of perhaps 50 people who had converted an old tourist resort into a defensible settlement. They had water access from a deep well that had been protected from the fallout, but limited filtration capabilities. Sarah greeted us at their perimeter checkpoint, older and more weathered than when I'd last seen her, but unmistakably herself, and apparently free. "I didn't know if you'd survived," she said simply. "When we heard the radio broadcasts about Flagstaff's water reclamation projects, I hoped it might be you." After thorough security protocols, she explained why she had reached out. Their settlement had been monitoring radiation patterns in the region, using equipment salvaged from a university research station. They had discovered something unexpected. The fallout was dissipating faster in certain areas due to unique weather patterns and soil composition. The areas we thought would be contaminated for decades might be habitable much sooner, she explained, showing us their detailed maps and readings, including areas with significant water reservoirs that your current models probably write off as too dangerous. The information was potentially game-changing for our expansion efforts. If accurate, it meant we could reclaim water sources we had assumed would be unusable for years, dramatically accelerating recovery. But equally valuable was what this connection represented. Independent groups sharing crucial information, working together rather than competing. As we coordinated plans to verify their findings and integrate our water filtration expertise with their radiation monitoring, I saw the outlines of something more significant than individual survival. 4 days later, I stood in Flagstaff's main meeting hall presenting Sarah's data to the assembled community leaders and military personnel. The implications were significant, not just for water reclamation but for agricultural expansion, settlement patterns, and long-term recovery planning. If these patterns hold, I concluded, we can establish a network of connected communities throughout the region within a year, each with sustainable water and food production. The recovery timeline just accelerated dramatically. Colonel Reeves addressed the practical considerations. We'll need to verify this data independently, establish secure transportation corridors between settlements, and coordinate resource allocation. But if confirmed, this changes our strategic approach entirely. As the meeting dispersed into excited discussion groups, Maya approached with a practical question that cut to the heart of our future. If these additional areas become habitable, who decides who goes where? Who gets access to the new resources? It was the same fundamental question we'd faced since the beginning: how to allocate limited resources fairly, how to build a society that didn't revert to the strongest taking from the weakest. We establish principles now, I suggested, before necessity forces desperate decisions. Equal access to essential resources, knowledge sharing rather than hoarding, mutual support between settlements. Dr. Hoffman joined us, his medical perspective always grounded in human realities. In the prison system, you saw how water became a control mechanism. Here, we have the opportunity to make it a connector instead. He was right. Water, clean, safe, abundant water, could be the foundation of a different kind of rebuilding. Not isolated compounds protecting their resources from outsiders, but interconnected communities sharing knowledge and supporting mutual growth. Later that evening, I walked to the edge of town with my custom multi-tool in hand, surveying the expanding water distribution network that now reached the outermost buildings. Pipes and filtration systems that would have seemed mundane before the bombs fell now represented something profound: the infrastructure of renewal. Maya found me there, watching the sunset over our growing community. Without speaking, she handed me a small container. Inside was a seedling, one of her experimental plants bred for radiation resistance and water efficiency. First successful germination of the new variant, she explained, designed for the conditions in the areas Sarah identified. I understood the symbol immediately. The plant represented a future that extended beyond mere survival, beyond our current boundaries. Like the water systems we were building, it was adaptable, resilient, designed for the world that existed now rather than clinging to what had been lost. 90 days after the bombs fell, standing on the edge of our expanding community with a seedling in one hand and my water tool in the other, I finally allowed myself to believe in something I had only hoped for during our desperate journey: that human ingenuity and cooperation might yet build something worthwhile from the radioactive dust of the old world. The scars on my arm would always remind me of what we had survived. But the flowing water, the growing plants, and the expanding connections between survivors pointed toward what we might yet become.